I once stopped to reflect on what fate awaited the soul of someone who, having dedicated their entire existence to spiritually guiding others, only to discover in the end that they had made a fundamental mistake. For years, I was convinced that I was walking the right path, that every word, every teaching, and every piece of advice I gave was aligned with divine truth. But what I encountered after crossing the threshold of death was a reality more devastating than I could have imagined. Now I know with absolute certainty that hell is not an abstract concept, nor a mere symbol of spiritual punishment. It is a chillingly tangible place where screams and wails echo perpetual agony, and where former religious leaders who strayed from the true path suffered indescribable torment. There, none of my earthly works, titles, or accolades mattered in the slightest. The only thing that prevailed was the naked and overwhelming truth, mercilessly revealed, exposing the real consequences of every word spoken and every decision. I realized too late that every erroneous teaching I imparted not only condemned myself but also chained the souls of those who trusted my words. I discovered that the worst thing wasn't the fire or the darkness, but the relentless clarity with which each of my actions and motivations was revealed. I saw how my spiritual pride had become the most dangerous trap, leading me inevitably toward an eternal destiny of suffering and damnation. I thought my position and knowledge would protect me from judgment, but instead, those same things became my downfall. In this place, every action I omitted, distorted, or ignored was revealed to me without the possibility of defending or justifying myself. The souls I led astray became invisible chains that dragged me deeper into the abyss. This experience I now share is not only a chronicle of punishment but an urgent warning about the importance of every choice we make and every word we decide to believe or pass on, because in the end, we will all face the consequences of our spiritual decisions. I have decided to share this story not to provoke fear, but as a call to spiritual awareness. Imagine for a moment discovering, after a lifetime of believing you are faithfully serving God, that you have actually deceived yourself and that everything you built has crumbled to ashes before the eternal tribunal. This story contains profound revelations about a hell that few dare to speak about openly and about spiritual truths that have the power to radically transform the course of a life. We seek divine guidance and protection from dangers that often remain invisible to our eyes, beats that silently stalk our souls without us even being aware of them. I discovered along my path that the spiritual life is a crucial journey where every prayer uttered with genuine faith possesses the extraordinary power to break down spiritual barriers, break invisible chains, and dispel even the densest shadows. Authentic prayer can bring clarity to those moments of darkness that seem impossible to overcome. This testimony is much more than a simple personal revelation, it is an open invitation to unite spiritually, strengthening our faith through mutual intervention. For only united can we resist the constant attacks that seek to separate us from the true purpose that God has planned for our lives. Therefore, I want to encourage you to share your prayer request, whether for yourself, a family member, or someone close to you that you love. Together in spiritual communion, we will raise these requests before God with the certainty that He will hear every sincere plea. I was that man whom many deeply admired, a figure who, from the pulpit, captivated the crowds with speeches that touched the most sensitive fibers of the human heart. For many years, I held an influential position, spiritually guiding thousands of people along a path we all assumed was authentic. In their eyes, I represented a genuine example of faith, someone capable of bringing answers in times of uncertainty and being a beacon in the midst of the deepest darkness. I firmly believed I was a representative chosen by God, destined to enlighten lives and lead souls toward salvation. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, the initial purity of my mission began to deteriorate. What had once been a heart entirely dedicated to the service of God and the spiritual well-being of others was gradually contaminated by seeds of pride, vanity, and a growing need for personal recognition. Without realizing it, I transformed into an archetypal religious leader who believed himself infallible, convinced that he was the owner of an absolute truth that only I could correctly interpret. Initially, the small deviations I took did not seem worrying to me. Ultimately, the applause was constant, and the faithful's trust in my work grew. Words grew stronger day by day. As time passed, I became deeply convinced that my interpretations of the scriptures were superior and unique. I saw myself as the exclusive possessor of profound revelations inaccessible to others. This mistaken perception of spiritual superiority eventually diverted me from the genuine purpose of my vocation. Gradually, the pulpit ceased to be a consecrated place of worship and became my own personal stage, where I played the leading role, seeking not divine glory but my own exaltation. In the eyes of the world, I appeared to have absolutely everything: success, influence, and a seemingly indestructible reputation. However, when the lights went out and I was left alone with my thoughts, I felt an inner emptiness growing, an absence that no applause, praise, or recognition could fill. I instinctively knew that something vital was missing from my life, even though I steadfastly refused to acknowledge it. I consistently ignored those inner signs, those subtle spiritual whispers that warned me that I was drifting further and further away. I justified my actions by claiming that although my methods were dubious, they served the ultimate purpose of saving souls. But deep within that place of absolute sincerity that I did not want to face, I was fully aware that something was profoundly wrong, that my spiritual life was sustained on false foundations built solely on pride and self-sufficiency. Finally, and without warning, the unexpected occurred. An abrupt circumstance outside an unexpected accident, a sudden illness, or an unforeseeable event ended my earthly life and brought me face to face with the reality of death. Upon crossing that unknown threshold, I was plunged into a dense, infinite darkness that completely enveloped me. At first, I thought it was a passing nightmare, but very soon I realized that that place surpassed any human concept of suffering. I felt my entire soul shudder before that terrifying reality in which there was no peace, only a profound despair caused by the total and absolute separation from everything I had previously considered good and fair. It was there, in the midst of that absolute darkness, that for the first time I was able to fully understand the price of my wrong decisions. In that dark place, I finally faced the harsh reality of my existence. It was as if an intangible but cruelly accurate mirror reflected back at me every action, every word, and every intention that had guided my life. For the first time, I understood with heartbreaking intensity, clarity, that those actions I believed for years I had performed for the glory of God were in reality motivated by a deep personal ambition, by an insatiable hunger for recognition and power. Every word I spoke from the pulpit under the guise of enlightening others was a disguised strategy to feed my own ego. I watched in horror as the souls who had blindly trusted me, who had placed their faith in my words and who, due to my distorted teachings, had strayed toward perdition. The pain of that revelation was unbearable not only because of the condemnation I myself faced, but because I now fully understood that my greatest crime was having dragged so many others down with me. The darkness that surrounded me seemed to breathe, aware of my presence, silently mocking my despair. In the midst of that relentless oppression, voices began to emerge that at first seemed distant, but I quickly recognized them as echoes from the depths of my own conscience. These voices were not simple screams. The accusations of suffering were direct accusations that laid bare every justification and excuse I had ever uttered. There was no place to hide. Before me was exposed the absolute truth about who I truly was in the eyes of God. Every act of pride, every manipulation disguised as virtue, every decision made from the deepest selfishness now weighed on my soul with an inescapable force. I tried to defend myself by saying I had done many good works, but my words lost all meaning in that place. I bitterly discovered that good works done with selfish intentions have no value in divine judgment. It was then that I recognized what I had always feared most. I had become a wolf in sheep's clothing. I thought I was leading souls toward God, but in reality, I was leading them away from Him, leading them to a destiny as dark as my own. What had begun with passion and sincerity had transformed, without my noticing, into a perverse tool of spiritual destruction. A question then echoed in my mind with terrifying force: how many souls they lost because of you? Although I tried desperately to find an answer, I felt the number was overwhelming and incalculable. Every face, every voice, every person I had misled was embedded deep in my consciousness, impossible to forget. I tried to cry out for forgiveness, but my voice had been silenced. I wanted to escape, but there was nowhere to run. I was trapped by the irrevocable weight of my decisions, facing an inescapable reality. My situation was the sole result of my own actions. In that instant, I knew that hell was much more than a physical place. It was an eternal state of absolute separation from God, where every soul must fully confront the consequences of their deepest actions and intentions. There, I understood with devastating clarity that my entire life boiled down to tragic and unexpected outcomes, consequences I never thought I would have to face. Suddenly, I felt the darkness that surrounded me take on an almost palpable physical weight that oppressed every part of my being. I was overcome by the sensation of falling into an abyss. Infinite, without ground or direction. Every moment seemed eternal, permeated with an indescribable anguish. I couldn't understand exactly what was happening, but I had a terrifying certainty. This place was not the eternal rest I had preached so much in life. There was no peace there, only perpetual despair. As I sank deeper, the voices multiplied around me. I perceived screams, cries, and accusations coming from all sides. Although I couldn't see anyone, I was aware that I was not alone. Suddenly, a faint light appeared in the darkness. But this light wasn't a light that brought relief, but rather one that dimmed the cold. It increased the emptiness and weighed me down even more. Little by little, this faint clarity made a grotesque and terrifying landscape emerge before my eyes, slowly revealing a hellish environment that I could never have imagined. I observed, filled with terror, burning rivers that did not consume physical matter but seemed to directly consume souls, causing suffering beyond any earthly experience. In the distance, wails could be heard, endless cries pleading for mercy that would never be answered. I saw deformed figures moving among the shadows, formless but living beings permeated by an essence of despair and torment that filled my soul with a terror I never thought possible. Everything that surrounded me in that terrifying landscape seemed permeated by a deep and inescapable essence of absolute despair. Then I clearly perceived that I was being led, although not by visible hands or by anyone I could identify. In reality, an inexplicable and irresistible force was slowly dragging me through that place. With each step, I felt my soul lose strength, as if the ground itself were draining away the little spiritual vitality that still remained in me. The atmosphere became unbearable, suffocating, saturated by a guilt that until that moment had been intangible, but now taking on a palpable form, enveloping me like an invisible chain that I could not break. In that instant, I understood with painful lucidity that that place was the direct and exact manifestation of my inner state, a living reflection of who I had really been. Hell was not only a physical place of eternal punishment, but the devastating amplification of all my mistakes, sins, and deceptions committed throughout my life. Each step plunged me deeper into this agonizing revelation, as the voices around me ceased to be simple random shouts and became clear words. Familiar phrases that I recognized immediately. I heard my own sermons again, each message spoken to manipulate, deceive, or instill fear in the people who trusted me. My empty promises resonated clearly, those false assurances I offered merely to maintain my position, even though I knew they were lies disguised as truth. The weight of these words was unbearable, as I realized that not only had they caused suffering to those who listened to me in life, but now, paradoxically, they were used as a cruel instrument to torment me. Then, the shadows, which until then had been vague figures, slowly began to take on distinct faces. I recognized with horror the faces of people who had blindly believed in my teachings, who had followed me, and who now shared my terrible fate. Their gazes, filled with anger and despair, pierced me deeply, establishing an unbreakable and tortuous bond that prevented me from looking away. These faces, now condemned like me, were living and indelible evidence of the direct consequences of my decisions. Each one represented tangible proof of the devastating scope of my words and actions, becoming a constant accusation that tortured my conscience. I wanted to escape their gaze, to turn away, but it was impossible because their eyes followed me incessantly, reminding me again and again of the irreversible damage I had caused. Just then, I perceived the imposing presence of something different. It was not a human being, nor was it something fully spiritual. It was a powerful figure shrouded in shadows whose mere proximity radiated an inescapable and oppressive authority. This figure remained silent, but I immediately knew that he was exposing my entire life, revealing every detail to me as if slowly flipping through an open book. First, I saw scenes from my childhood, innocent and pure moments when my heart was still close to God. However, as the pages of this painful exposition turned, I clearly saw how corruption crept into my soul. It showed me the choices made out of convenience every time I chose my own pride over humility. Every time I sought my own glory over divine glory. The figure didn't utter a single word, but I clearly received a message that echoed through my mind like an inescapable echo. You chose this. I tried to argue, justify my actions, defend myself, but every excuse I tried to come up with crumbled in the face of an absolutely irrefutable truth. I understood in that moment with devastating clarity that I had always known deep down that I was wrong, but I had consciously chosen to ignore the warnings. I had decided to continue down the path of pride and self-sufficiency, leading me to this inescapable destiny. When that presence finally disappeared, I was completely alone again. But now I understood with absolute certainty where I was and why I had come to be. This place of eternal torment was the direct and precise consequence of my own decisions. There was no possibility of escape, nor could I even scream for help, for my voice remained trapped in the despair that surrounded me. The only feeling that lingered was the crushing certainty that I was exactly where I deserved to be. Can you even imagine being in a place where every mistake I had made it magnifies cruelly before you, with no chance of defense or redemption? It is a reality too terrifying even to conceive, but this is precisely the reality reserved for those who turn away from divine truth, mistakenly convinced that they will never have to face the consequences of their actions. This experience led me to understand that what had happened was not an isolated event, but a reality that profoundly affects every person, even if we are rarely aware of it. As I progressed deeper into that dark place, the clarity of what I was facing increased terrifyingly. What had at first seemed like a confusion of vague doubts and fears now became a direct and brutal confrontation with the absolute reality of my existence. I was able to observe with frightening clarity my entire life, not through the filter I had carefully constructed to justify myself, but as it truly was from the eternal perspective. All those justifications, excuses, and explanations that I had used for years to hide my mistakes crumbled before me, leaving only the crudeness of my actions, my selfish decisions, and my hidden intentions were revealed. The lie I had lived was not only directed at others, but I was the one most deeply deceived. For years, I was convinced that I possessed absolute control, believing that my position as a spiritual leader gave me unquestionable authority. In my arrogance, I came to assume that people depended on my exclusive interpretation of the truth, turning the sacred into a commodity destined to exploit the insecurities and fears of those who trusted me. Now each manipulation unfolded before my eyes with heartbreaking clarity, showing how I had used my speeches, supposedly delivered in the name of God, to exalt my own image and reputation. I watched with deep pain as small seeds of pride, inadvertently sown over the years, grew until my heart became fertile ground for arrogance and vanity. Slowly, I had transformed into a leader whose primary concern was to keep his image intact and strengthen his prestige, even if it meant distorting the truth. The warning signs were constantly there, moments when God tried to steer me back to the right path through subtle messages, wise advice, or loving criticism that I ignored or rejected out of pride. I clearly remembered people I tried to silence simply because they dared to question my apparent infallibility. In a moment of terrifying lucidity, I understood that my life had been reduced to a spectacle and I was the main actor in a spiritual charade. The beautiful and powerful words I spoke in public were hollow, lacking the divine essence I intended to communicate. I remembered how I had deliberately used the fear of hell to keep those who listened to me under control, not to genuinely warn them of spiritual danger but to ensure their dependence on me. The devastating irony was evident. The same hell with which I so manipulated others had now become my eternal reality. The moment these truths hit me with their full force, the environment began to transform again. I found myself transported to an immense hall where shadows seemed to possess a life of their own, moving restlessly around me, vigilant and ready to expose my every flaw. The entire space was permeated with a palpable energy of judgment. Absolute, as if every corner of the place could observe every flaw in my soul, revealing them mercilessly. I clearly felt that it wasn't human eyes judging me, but a much greater and deeper presence, capable of penetrating even the most hidden recesses of my being. In the midst of that unbearable tension, the voices returned, but now they were very different. They were no longer simply distant echoes of my words, but direct and precise accusations, confronting me with the devastating reality of my actions. I heard clear phrases laden with pain, like you telling me that God hated me. It was because of you that I completely lost faith. Each accusation pierced my spirit like a sharp, relentless knife. I clearly recognized those voices as the people who had placed their trust in me, who had fully believed in my teachings, and whose faces I now contemplated with profound anguish, marked by the irreversible damage my words had caused. Faced with this judgment, I understood that my responsibility was not limited only to my own life but extended to every soul that had negatively impacted me. I tried to defend myself. I desperately tried to explain my intentions, to justify my past actions, but no words could escape my lips. There, faced with the undeniable weight of the naked truth, I stood powerless and voiceless, trapped in the heartbreaking knowledge of the eternal consequences of my decisions. Those voices, with absolute indifference to any excuse I might attempt, confronted me directly with the brutal reality of my actions. I discovered that in this trial, what mattered was not what I had intended to do, but only what I actually did. Every lie uttered, every manipulative act had sown seeds of doubt, confusion, and destruction in the lives of those who trusted me. Now I was reaping, with no possibility of avoiding them, the bitter consequences of those seeds. The worst, the most painful, was admitting that deep down I had always been aware of my own deception. I understood then that the greatest tragedy lay not only in my actions but also in what I had consciously decided not to do. I saw every opportunity I had to change my life pass before me with cruel clarity. Every opportunity God granted me to repent and rectify my path. I observed those brave people who tried to warn me, who raised their voices to make me see my mistakes, but whom I arrogantly silenced or ignored, firmly believing in my spiritual superiority. Each of these moments now weighed on me like an irreparable loss, like opportunities I could never recover. In the midst of this overwhelming revelation, I felt something deeper than simple guilt. It was an unbearable feeling of ultimate loss. I finally understood that I could not go back, that every choice I had made in life had been irrevocably sealed for eternity. Desperate, I wanted to scream and beg for a second chance, but the environment around me seemed to absorb all hope, leaving only the naked reality of my existence exposed. Imagine for a moment what it means to face the worst of yourself without any possibility of escape or justification for your actions. It is an experience. It is heartbreaking beyond words, and it is a reality that deeply concerns us all, even though we rarely fully acknowledge it. As I stood there, I could feel the surroundings vibrating with an imposing and eternal energy, as if every particle of the air were burdened with the immeasurable weight of divine judgment. I was completely alone, but at the same time, I felt the presence of an invisible multitude, as if the entire cosmos was silently witnessing the moment when I would fully confront the essence of my being. There was no physical room where the judgment took place, but I knew without a doubt that I was being examined and judged not by men, but by something infinitely greater and more penetrating, a presence capable of seeing beyond mere words and external actions to the very depths of the human heart. At that precise moment, the shadows around me began to move slowly, taking on eerily familiar shapes, images taken directly from my own life, but now presented with terrifying starkness. Episodes that I had never publicly shown before unfolded before my eyes. Hidden wrong decisions that I had always justified as inevitable or necessary. I clearly saw every situation in which I manipulated events for personal gain, every lie carefully crafted to protect my image and prestige. I also remembered with a stabbing pain the times I deliberately ignored the suffering of others simply because it didn't benefit me at all. Each of these scenes was like a direct blow to my conscience, and although I desperately tried to look away, it was impossible. But the true agony came when I began to contemplate the real consequences of those selfish decisions. I observed how each mistake of mine had unleashed devastating effects, cascading into the lives of many people. Like a relentless domino effect, a simple lie uttered from the pulpit sowed deep doubts in the hearts of believers, slowly distancing them from God until they led to definitive spiritual separation. I saw the faces of those who had placed their faith in me, now betrayed by my hypocrisy. Some were trapped in perpetual cycles of spiritual anguish that I myself had brought upon myself, while others shared my fate in that dark place, casting accusing glances at me that were impossible to erase from my memory. But then the judgment intensified, becoming even deeper and more detailed. I realized with horror that it was not only my actions that were being judged, but also my most secret intentions. Every hidden thought, every selfish desire carefully held behind a facade of holiness, was now completely and mercilessly exposed, revealing before me a reality too bitter and shameful to contemplate. I watched with heartbreaking clarity as pride had slowly poisoned my heart, how that uncontrollable thirst for power and recognition had clouded my vision, rendering me incapable of recognizing the true needs of the people God had entrusted to me. It became clear to me that the leadership I exercised was never genuinely oriented toward bringing souls closer to God, but was only a carefully disguised means to consolidate my authority and feed an ego that skillfully concealed beneath apparent humility. Then a voice that did not come from outside but from within my soul began to resonate with terrifying clarity. It contained no anger, hatred, or even reproach. It was simply a stern, deep voice whose solemnity far surpassed any human cry or accusation. His words were direct and inescapable. You were called to be a shepherd, but you chose to be a mercenary. You led people to perdition while believing you were saving them. You traded the glory of God for the glory of men, and now you behold the ultimate outcome of your decisions. I wanted to speak, to argue, to present my intentions as an excuse, but the heavy, irrefutable truth mercilessly crushed any attempt at defense. I stood there in absolute silence as the reality of my eternal destiny unfolded clearly before me. The most terrifying thing was not the punishment, but the unbearable transparency with which all these truths were revealed. There was no ambiguity, and no room for interpretation. The pure, stark reality of what I was before me, inescapable. I also realized how throughout my life I had constantly used the concept of judgment as a tool to control others, imposing my own rules and manipulating their actions to suit my personal desires. Now, ironically, I was facing the real judgment. And all those words and tactics I once used to dominate others violently returned to me, becoming my own torment. I felt naked and totally exposed in a way I had never imagined possible. There was no escape or refuge. The most intense cruelty of that experience was knowing deeply that I deserved every moment of that torment. Around me, dark figures continued their endless murmurs and accusations, pointing at me relentlessly. I recognized some faces. They were other spiritual leaders who had fallen into the same trap of arrogance and pride. This brought me no comfort. On the contrary, it increased my anguish even more, because I knew perfectly well that I could have chosen a different path. I understood then that I had been called to be an example of virtue and fidelity. But now it was only a living warning, a sad story of spiritual terror that no one would ever wish to repeat. The ground beneath my feet vibrated disturbingly, as if hell itself were reacting to the intensity of the weight of my guilt. I felt a growing, oppressive, and suffocating heat that seemed to rise from within me, as if my own soul were being consumed. Slowly burning in spiritual flames, I knew with agonizing certainty that this was just the beginning. What I faced was only the first stage of a torment whose magnitude was impossible to conceive. Can you imagine what it means to face, without escape, all the wrong choices made in life with the absolute certainty that there is no longer any hope of changing your destiny? This is precisely what makes spiritual judgment so excruciatingly terrifying. Every choice we make today profoundly defines the eternity we will face tomorrow. The silence that followed this judgment was so overwhelming and absolute that it drowned out any sound I could imagine. I understood then that there was no longer any way to erase or evade the reality revealed before me. Every selfish action, every manipulative word, and every choice motivated by pride was now too deep within me as an indelible testament to the destiny I had chosen for myself. I felt the weight of all those consequences not as something abstract or distant, but as a real and overwhelming presence that extinguished even the slightest impulse to resist. It wasn't just an external burden, but a powerful force that seemed to spring from the depths of my being, burning like a fire that was impossible to extinguish. Once again, I felt that invisible force dragging me inexorably toward the darkest and the most sinister depths of the abyss in which I found myself. While the surroundings were changing, I had the terrifying certainty that my torment was just beginning. I was led into a darkness unlike any I had experienced up to that point. It wasn't simply the absence of light, but something living, an entity that consumed any vestige of hope or comfort. There, the screams returned, but now they were different, filled with direct accusations that pierced every corner of my mind. Each voice echoed, relentlessly reminding me of every life I had affected with my actions. Not only those I directly deceived, but also the many who suffered indirectly because of my selfish words or decisions. Each scream felt like a sharp sword plunging deep into my soul, exposing the devastating degree of my spiritual failure. I tried desperately to cover my ears, but it was useless, as these voices were not coming from outside, but from within me. It was as if every word spoken during my life was coming back, amplified by the terrible weight of its consequences. I felt guilt, shame, and remorse slowly consumed me. But beyond that, I experienced an absolute and indescribable emptiness caused by the total absence of God. I understood then with unbearable clarity that the greatest torment of hell lay not in the fire in the shadows or in the heart-rending screams, but in that definitive separation from the only true source of life and light. This place seemed to react directly to my pain. Every cry of despair, every thought of regret, seemed to feed the very environment, further strengthening the darkness that trapped me. Even the ground vibrated and throbbed beneath my feet, absorbing my life force with every step I tried to take. There was no possible way out, nowhere to run. I was completely surrounded by the irrevocable results of my own choices, with no one to blame but myself. As I slowly moved forward, I was led toward an even more terrifying and disturbing sight that I could never forget. In front of me stretched an infinite number of souls trapped in eternal and relentless suffering. I recognized some people among them. Those I had personally guided, who had trusted me with absolute sincerity and who now shared my same destiny. Their gazes, filled with pain but also with deep recrimination, seemed to question me incessantly. Why did you deceive us? Why did you keep us from the truth? I tried to respond. I desperately tried to justify myself, but no words came out of my lips. I was completely speechless before the cruel reality that unfolded before my eyes, but the vision didn't stop there. New scenes from my life began to project themselves, now seen from a perspective I had never considered before. I watched as each word, spoken in moments of pride, negligence, or carelessness, became spiritual chains that kept those people bound. I understood with horror how my example, which should have been a beacon of light, ended up being a dark shadow that slowly extinguished the faith of many. I could also see all the opportunities I had,